Okay, so as requested, I'm going to talk about stylization and applying textures to frames and walk you guys through a little bit of my designing process. So I'm going to start by first showing you guys how I make my own textures. But before I start, I'm going to first say one of the biggest changes I made to my process after graduating from CCS was switching from primarily using Illustrator to make frames to primarily using Photoshop. That wasn't really by choice. As I started to work with other designers, it seemed like Photoshop was used by more people and it was annoying to have Illustrator files while sharing frames and going back and forth. But now I don't think I could go back. I think you can do a lot more in Photoshop than that you just can't do in Illustrator. Working in Photoshop is also helpful because it keeps your file size down. So using each frame as its own file, where in Illustrator you generally have one file with multiple artboards, and that can get huge and slow pretty quickly. Textures. So before I started, I scanned in some textures and I have some old ones that I've scanned in before of just like crumpled pieces of paper. So I'm gonna start with this one. I'm gonna drag it into Photoshop. And as I scan these, I usually scan them in as big as possible. So I think this one was scanned at 600 DPI, and I just wanted to get, even though like screen resolution is only 72, but this way I can blow it up pretty large, and it still has a lot of detail. After you open it in Photoshop, the first thing that I'm going to do is just sort of mess around to clean this up a little bit. So I'm going to straighten this edge, and then I don't think I really need to mess around with the levels that much, but I'm just going to sort of adjust it a little bit so it looks a little cleaner. Okay, so that looks pretty good. This one didn't really take that much work. It was pretty clean to begin with. So the next thing I'm gonna do is this, I don't even know what it's called, this image calculations. And that'll bring up this dialog box. And here, you kind of have to just mess around. The goal, this is kind of a bad example for this, but the goal is to get the thing that you want cut out to be white and then the background to be black. So this will be easier to see once I show you with this, like a scribble. But for this one, I'm just gonna keep this like this. I don't think this will really do much. Actually, that did. The goal is to get the most contrast possible, so that's fine. And in my channels panel, you can see that it sort of popped up this alpha 1 channel. And I'm gonna command click on it, and that will select the mask. And you can see it sort of like gave these little marching ants around some of these things. It's still kind of difficult to see, but when I click this mask button here with my layer selected, and I'm just gonna make that a clipping mask, you can see that it added some transparency to the background. So what's good about this is now I have sort of like this realistic paper texture, and this is really nice. So I'm just gonna make, I'm gonna make this a smart object and drag it into here. So like, let's say this one is my frame that I'm designing. This works really well because you can create realistic paper layers. So that's my piece of paper. I have just like my background layer. So I have a black background. And I'm gonna add another layer on here. I'm gonna make this background white actually. Let's say there's just like a normal scribble on here, and then you can see it's like a little bit transparent, but not totally transparent. so it looks like it's two pieces of paper. These are probably a little bit too transparent, but if I open this back up and with my layer mask selected, I'm gonna hide these ones. With just this layer mask selected, you can sort of adjust the levels this way. So if I want it just like a little bit lighter, that usually does it. And yeah, you can see it's not as transparent now, but there's still some transparency. And then you can just like mess around with the layers. You can add, don't use drop shadows really, but you can add a subtle drop shadow. And see, now it looks like two pieces of paper stacked on top of each other. So that's how you do that. Okay, so you can also use this same process to cut out markers, like markers that you scribbled on a piece of paper and scanned in. So I have that here. And the first thing I'm gonna do is what I did last time, is just sort of adjust these levels. So with your levels panel open, if you click this dark, so this will get the black point of the piece. So you're gonna click that and click where this marker is the darkest. So that makes it the contrast higher. And if I were to click here, it makes it even more darker, but I wanna keep some of that transparency, so I'm gonna click over here. And then you can do the same thing with white. So with this white one, I'm gonna click on the background, and that didn't really do much, but you get the point. And now I'm just gonna get rid of the color because it's a little blue and I don't want it to be. And then I'm gonna make that a smart object and do the same thing. So go to Image, Calculations, and this will be easier to see. So I'm gonna do red. That's fine, but I want these colors to be opposite. So I'm just gonna click Invert, and that's what I want it to look like. So now I'm gonna click OK, and that will give me my alpha 1 layer again in channels, and I'm gonna Command click and click the mask tool with my layer selected. And you can see now that I have these marker layers, but it retained some of the transparency. So if I were to, I'm gonna make this another smart object. Nope. And I'm gonna just cut out this one and bring it into my file. But now it looks like this marker is on this piece of paper, and usually if you just change the blending mode to multiply, it looks even better. So now I have this realistic looking scribble on top of this piece of paper that I have complete control over. So if I wanted to change the position, it's really easy to do that. If I had some type, I can layer this over top of it and make my frame look however I want it to look. You can also use this process, so let's look. I have these ripped pieces of construction paper that I have previously scanned in, and I'm gonna open them up in Photoshop, and you can use this, a similar process, it's not exactly the same, to cut this out, but keep all of these little fuzzy things to make it look like the paper is actually ripped and not sort of like digitally cut out. The only difference is for this one, first I'm gonna do the same step and sort of adjust my levels. So I want my white background. That's a little too dark. I'm not gonna do that yet. Delete. So I have this layer, and the way I'm gonna cut this out is take this blue channel, I'm gonna duplicate the channel, click OK, hide that one, or make this blue copy visible, hide the other one, and then Command I to invert it, and that makes it black and white. And now I'm gonna take my levels, so Command L, my white eyedropper, and click on that, my black, click on the background, and now I have more contrast. And then I'm just gonna take my brush tool and just change it to like a big soft round brush, make it bigger, and change the mode up here from normal to overlay, and then make sure these are black and white. And I'm just gonna go over top to get the most contrast between the black and white. So the goal is to get the part that you want to cut out solid white and the background solid black. Okay, so that's pretty good. Do the same thing with holding Command, click that alpha layer now, and click mask. Oops. And now I have this cut out, and the background, or the little hairy things, are still there. It doesn't work great with dark backgrounds, but you know, like that looks pretty good. And I can cut one of these out. And move it into this composition that I have. And that looks pretty good. I mean, not the composition, but as far as like how realistic it looks, you still have some of those fuzzy things, and there's a little bit of transparency where the page was ripped. So that process that we used for the construction paper also works really well for cutting out people if they're on a white background, specifically their hair. You kind of have to, it takes a little practice and you kind of have to mess around with it a little bit, but it's really useful for cutting things out. So basically the process for making your own textures is just kind of fucking around with these settings until you get the look that you want. You can also change, so if I wanted to change the color of this, gradient maps work really well. Anyways, again, it's messing around in Photoshop to change the colors. Next, as far as resources for textures, what I like is, I really like this black market. They have a lot of stuff that is pretty high quality, so if you have the funds, if you can get their everything zip, that's only $100 and you get so much. I have it and I can show you. So you get so much stuff. And I really like these grain textures. They're really nice. I use those. And I really like their prisms. Like I said, there's so much in here. So as far as these, so like, let's go back to these. So if I wanted to use this, I would just drag it onto my comp. My layers are a little messed up. And I'm gonna just change the blending mode. That one looks pretty good. And then if I wanted it to have this prism, can mess with it that way. And so now it's just adding that next level of detail. This is a lovely composition. So that's all from Black Market, and like I said, there's so much in here, but if you don't have the funds, the individual ones are pretty cheap, and this trash machine is definitely worth it. Like I said, I really like the prism one. Their shiny one is good, and their just like scratches texture is good. They also have like these pieces of paper that are really nice. They have a lot of good stuff, like stickers and tape. It's a really good resource. I also like True Grit Texture Supply. These ones are a little bit fancier. Not really, but it's mostly like brushes. So they have some really good brushes in here. They have some really good Photoshop actions, which is the same thing as this trash machine. That's an action that will sort of do the process for you. But these are all really good. They have some texture packs. They also have some free stuff. So that's really nice. And then also this one's a little bit more hit or miss, but so the Avanto Market Graphic River has some good things in here sometimes. You kind of have to look a little bit because some of them are pretty like, what the heck, why would I ever need that? But I think, so my favorite texture that I use all the time is this CMYK and RGB ink. And I use this black one on everything. I used it on this Spotify spot, it's the background. I used it on these frames that I made for an MTV show right here and here. I used it on this Michelle Obama frame. You can see it's here. I use it on everything. I probably used it on this, yeah. And I can show you, so the way that this frame is working, these are all my layers. And this is the texture that I was talking about. And when I hide it and show it, you can see the difference that it makes, where it makes it look like it's all printed on one rather than like the lines are just like crisp and clean. So I use that one all the time. And I'm pretty sure I got it from Graphic River. So those are just sort of some good resources. Also a good rule of thumb is once you start working, just to sort of like take the textures that you're using from other studios. So doing that, I have all of Andor's texture library, which I definitely use some of these more than others, but it's nice to have. I also have quite a few Getty logins saved on my computer from MTV. Just sort of, it's being a little scrappy and getting things how you can. Also, if you didn't know this already, Photoshop has some good brushes that are for free. If you didn't know this, with your brush tool selected, you can click this little arrow so you have this icon and then the actual brush preset you're using. You can click this little arrow and then go over to the gear and go to get more brushes, and that will take you to this page where they have all of these Kyle's brushes, which you used to have to pay for, but I think Adobe like bought him out or something, and now these are all for free and they're really, really good. I use them all the time. You don't really ever need to buy any other brushes just because there's so many. There's markers and like paint brushes. There's so many in here, like, and they're all for free. There's like patterns and halftones and splatters, and it's really great. I use these all the time. And they're like pretty nice. Like, amazing. That looks so nice. Beautiful. So that's a really good resource too, if you didn't know you had access to that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how to animate texture in After Effects. So I have one that I made in Photoshop. I just took a layer, I made a new layer, and I have this brush tool, and I'm actually gonna make it 4K, so I think that's 4K. It's close enough, because I want the detail to be pretty big so I can zoom in. So I'm just gonna like paint over it with this brush that I selected. And that gives it sort of like a painted look, organic feel. So I'm gonna go to Save As, Texture, great. Okay, so back in After Effects, I have my folder structure set up, and I'm gonna go to Composition, New Composition. I'm gonna name it Texture Animation, or just Texture. And then 1920, 30 frames per second, 5 seconds, great. So I have this comp, I'm gonna import this texture PSD. I'm gonna bring it in here. And since I made it 4K, it's twice the size of this comp, which is good. That gives me some detail in there. And now I'm just gonna make some keyframes on rotation. So now it's just spinning around like that. But it stops and I want it to continue on for the rest of the 5 seconds. So first thing I'm gonna do is right click, have all my keyframes selected, right click and go to toggle hold keyframe. So now it's just stepping through those motions rather than seeing all the frames in between. I'm gonna stretch it out so it doesn't go as fast. Perfect. And now I'm gonna alt click to hold up my expression windows, and I'm gonna do that expression loop out. And I'm gonna add cycle in here. So it continues in a cycle. So it's going from 1, 2, 3, then it goes back to the beginning, 1, 2, whatever. So now that animation continues for the rest of the time. So next thing I'm going to do is show you guys how to fake cell animation. So this is a good example of cell animation, and what it is basically drawing everything frame by frame rather than doing it digitally in After Effects. And you can still do cell animation digitally, I think most of the time. Like when I do it on my iPad in Procreate because they have good features to help you do that. You can also do it in Photoshop, and you can do it like the old traditional way with pen and paper. So now back in After Effects, what I'm going to do is just draw a circle. And so I have the circle, which nothing's happening yet because we haven't done anything. And this isn't very complicated. This is actually going to be pretty simple. It's just sort of a lot of steps. Okay, so in my content group under ellipse path, I'm going to alt click on size and type wiggle. And then I'm going to type 2,15. So what those numbers mean is the 2 is frequency and the 15 is amplitude. So it's saying 2 wiggles per second that are 15 something big. I'm not exactly sure. So that's giving this motion. I'm actually going to just make this a little bit more oblong, so the next step you can see a little bit easier. Which is, I'm going to take this same expression, so I'm going to copy, and under Transform Ellipse 1, I'm going to alt click on rotation and add that again. So now this is the movement that is happening. It's sort of like blobular and wiggling in place like that. And the reason why I did it just on these parameters was because if I were to get rid of that and go to add wiggle transform like we did last time and change it so 2 wiggles per second, and then transform, and I guess the scale was 15. That's what it's doing, and that's not really what I want to happen because I don't want the whole scale of the thing to change. I just kind of want like this path scale, so I want the path to stay the same and just wiggle that way. I'm gonna delete that, and then I want the rotation to wiggle, but I don't want anything else to wiggle. So that's the first step. Next, what I'm going to do is with this layer, I'm going to add some effects. So the first thing is I'm going to add a Gaussian blur. And I'm going to make it pretty big. I think I'm going to do 50. Yeah, so it makes the circle really fuzzy. But what's special is, and then I'm going to add levels. I'm going to drag that on this shape layer, and I'm going to change RGB to alpha. And in here, I'm going to crunch these really close together so it makes that edge kind of crisper. And so that doesn't really look like it did much, but if I were to go back into my shape layer content group and duplicate this circle, and then like, let's add some position keyframes. It's sort of giving it like this weird, like without those, the lines are a lot crisper. In this one, now it looks like they're more connected and more blobby. There, so it looks like they're sort of like stuck together. It looks more like goo rather than two shape layers. So great, I have my gooey balls, and the next thing I'm gonna do is add roughen edges. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna make it look like the edges are drawn rather than just crisp. So I'm gonna bump this complexity here up to 10, and that already gives, looks like it was maybe brushed on. And then I'm gonna make this border like that, and then make the edge like that, and that feels good to me. So it sort of looks a little bit rougher. And now finally I'm gonna add turbulent displace. And already you can see that it really like offsets those blobs there. But I want to add some keyframes to this evolution so it's moving. So I'm just gonna do one at the beginning and then one again a minute later. I'm gonna hit U to pull down my used keyframe so that pops up. And I'm gonna change it to just 180. So it's gonna rotate 180 degrees. Great, I'm gonna ease the keyframes just so it looks a little bit smoother. But I want this animation to continue for the duration of this comp, so I'm gonna alt click again on my stopwatch, and I'm going to add the same expression, so loop out, but instead of cycle, I'm gonna add continue, which means it's gonna start at 0, then it's going to 180 like we keyframed, but then it's just gonna keep adding 180 on top of itself. So it's moving around in a circle. And so I'm gonna make it a little smaller. So now that's what it's doing. And then I'm actually going to, on roughen edges, on evolution, I'm gonna add a wiggle expression. So I'm gonna alt click and just do wiggle, and I want it to be kind of small. So I'm gonna do 1. So a frequency of 1 wiggle per second and amplitude of 6. So now that those edges are moving a little bit too. It's really subtle, but you can kind of see it. So great, that's the basic motion of this, and it's not, I don't love this turbulent displace. I'm gonna mess around with it. That's a little better, I think. I don't know. And then actually I stand corrected. The last thing I'm going to add is a posterized time. And so what posterized time does is it changes the frame rate of the layer that it's on. So traditionally with style animation, you're not animating at 30 frames per second because that's kind of crazy to draw that much. So I'm going to just drop the frame rate from 30 to 10, and that'll make it feel a little bit more steppy and choppy. And the motion is still smooth, but it feels maybe a little bit more like traditional cell animation. So that is basically all of the animating I'm going to do. The next thing though is I'm going to add this texture that we already animated and drop it in here and change the track matte to an alpha matte. So now this layer is using this layer as a matte. So that texture is appearing as these blobs. And then I'm gonna just import one of those scans that I did from earlier. And now I'm gonna animate the paper so that feels like it's moving too. Okay, so now I have this thing that looks really organic and not so vectory and After Effects-y. I think if I probably just change this to multiply, yeah, that looks even better. Anyways, you get the point. This looks really organic and feels fluid, as opposed to if I took off all of these effects. There's a big difference, I think, between how this feels really digital, this feels really analog. And then you can just like keep adding stuff. So this is a black market texture. And if I change the blending mode, so now I just have this cute little animation. It feels, like I said, really organic and not digital. And if that is the look that you're going for, great. This is a really easy way to do it. And something that I did here just intuitively was like offset the type of rotations that are happening. So I think this texture, yeah, is taking 2 seconds to complete a cycle. This background scan is taking 1 second and 10 frames. And this top texture, which is the black market one, is taking 2 seconds and 20 frames. So nothing's moving together. It's all sort of happening separately. And that just makes it look a little bit more natural too, I think. So the last thing I'm going to do is show you guys how to animate brushes. And I'm going to start in Photoshop, just again with one of those Kyle's brushes that I showed you. I'm going to make a new layer. I'm just going to make it black. And I want it to sort of like loop around this. We'll see how that works. Especially because I'm not drawing it over top. So I'm just going to draw a line. I don't like that one. Great. So that's the line that I'm going to animate. And what I want is to keep in After Effects this sort of like natural looking ends to the brush, right? So I'm just gonna save this out as a layer. I'm going to import it and drag it into my comp, and I'm gonna put it underneath this texture layer. And I'm gonna change it to multiply. Sure. So right now nothing's happening. And the first thing I'm going to do is with my pen tool, I'm going to draw a shape layer over top. Just for the sake of me being able to see it, I'm going to make it red and make it approximately the same width. I'm going to draw a shape layer over top of this brush. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm gonna change the color back to white because we're just gonna use it as a matte, and I'm gonna go to put it over top my brush layer and go to alpha. And so now I'm going to, actually I'm not gonna do that yet because I wanna be able to see what I'm doing. I'm just gonna solo this layer so I can just focus on this. So with shape 1, I'm gonna add trim paths and just do a simple trim paths animation. Okay, so I just have this simple trim paths animation, and right now that doesn't look great, but the first thing I'm going to do is, in this stroke 1, remember how I said I don't know how to use this? Well, I looked into it, and I want to adjust it so it looks a little bit more natural, like that. So now that already looks pretty cool. And I'm gonna start it, I'm gonna add a keyframe, so when it finishes, it's like that. But I'm just gonna ease it and offset. That looks pretty good for now. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is add some of the same effects that we did on this shape layer of the circles. So I'm going to add roughen edges to my mask, my stroke that I did. And I want these to match this shape layer. Oops. So I'm just going to change them, I think. Actually, they're a little bit different. Just use these parameters. And then see, that's like a lot bigger than the last time, but I think when we take this off and hide this layer and make this an alpha matte, and now we'll solo this so we can see this, that edge looks a little bit more natural. And you can mess around with these to get them to look how you want. So if I add, yeah, I actually want the complexity to be like that. So now it looks like this, and the edge looks more like a brush stroke than that. Okay, and then lastly, I'm just gonna add a posterized time, I think, to this mask layer, and let's make it the same as what we were doing before, so 10. Oh right, because I haven't animated this complexity here, or I mean this evolution here, so I'm gonna alt click to pull that up and then make some keyframes here. So it's really subtle, but it is happening. On that tip. Okay, so that's all I'm doing on this shape layer. The next thing, I'm going to add turbulent displace First, I'm going to parent this brush layer, or this shape layer, to my brush so it stays the same position. And next, I'm going to add turbulent displace to my actual brush layer itself. Oops, that was the wrong one. And I want these parameters, I want this to be 20 and this to be smaller. So that's sort of what it looks like, but then I'm gonna add my evolution. And I'm gonna loop it. So now that's what's happening. Great, and then lastly, I'm just gonna add posterized time to this one, so it's not as smooth. Great, now that looks like it's wiggling a little bit like real cell animation. So now this is what my comp looks like. I think I'm gonna add I thought I just did this. I'm gonna add posterized time to this layer so that animation on isn't as smooth. Yeah, that's what I want it to look like. Okay, so that's sort of it for this tutorial. That's how I fake cell animation when I don't do real cell animation in After Effects. I used this technique on this Women in Film video that I showed you guys. You can see like that's sort of the same blob animation happening in the beginning. And then same thing on these, like nothing's actually cell animated in this, even though it might look like it is. So thanks for watching. I'll look for your beautiful blobs on the Google Drive. Have a good night.